Hey guys, and welcome back to the next installment of my Dead by Daylight weapon series. Today we're doing the Blight's Bonebuster. So I got a request for this one in the comments of one of my other videos, and to be honest, I hadn't planned to make this one because of how simple I thought it was. In game, it's kind of hard to see the details of this weapon because he's too busy like running around the map at light speed and then bouncing off the walls. So I'm like, oh, this will be super easy. So I got some really close-up reference pictures of it and was like, maybe this isn't gonna be so easy. Because it's actually a lady with no head. Of course, if I'd ever actually played the Blight, I probably would have noticed that. It involves tiny little hands and fabric draping. Two of the more difficult things to sculpt, but I went with it. As with the rest of this series, this video is sponsored by Coscom Cosplay Supplies. They provided all of the foam and stuff to make this. Unfortunately, the head required materials that they do not currently sell, but you should still check them out. Their high density foam is totally wondrous for projects like this where you're making something thin that needs to be stable and strong and supportive. So definitely check them out. Buy some stuff. Cons are back. What are you waiting for? Do it. But yeah, let's get into it. As always, we're starting with the pattern. You can find a link for this and all of my other Dead by Daylight patterns in the description below. For this build, I wanted to start with the gem. I tried to find a pre-made stone, but I couldn't find anything that was the right size, but I did find this handy silicone mold in the cake decorating section. And I already had some of this craft resin handy, so it just made sense to go this route. Once you've got your gloves on, we can start with the resin. This type is pretty user-friendly. It comes in 2 parts, resin and hardener. And they're going to be measured in equal parts. For this, I'm going to be doing about a tablespoon of each so I can make a few of these. So I'm pouring out equal parts by volume of the 2 parts in 2 separate cups. Then I'm going to be adding the tiniest bit of red tint. This is Alumilite red dye. EasyCast probably makes their own dyes, but I already had this one and it worked just fine. For this small amount of material, a single drop will go a really long way. You'll only add the tint to the resin portion and then mix it thoroughly. It's also good practice to mix the other part on its own before combining the two in a larger container. This is an extra large container, but whatever. Be sure to scrape the sides and mix this as thoroughly as possible. Then you just pour it into the mold. And this mold does not require any type of release agent because it's made of silicone. According to the package instructions, these will need to cure for 72 hours.
Several days later.
But once they've cured, you just pop them out. Next, I took to the task of wiring up a single LED to put behind the little gem. This setup was pretty simple. It's just a single red LED wired to a 3-volt battery and a switch. I'm not going to go into crazy detail about the electronics for this tutorial, but if you'd like more information about the products and the techniques that I use, definitely let me know and I can make a separate video. I started by soldering some of the approximate lengths of wire to the LED, red for the positive and black for the negative. The color isn't important, it just allows you to keep track of the positive and the negative ends once they're covered with solder. My basic technique for soldering is to melt the solder onto the tip of the iron and then touch it to the connection. If you've done this properly, the solder should just flow nicely over the connection and it will look very smooth and shiny. I also secure all the connections with heat shrink tubing. Then I wire the leads to the coordinating poles on the 3-volt battery holder. I tested to make sure the light was working and then moved on to the switch. I cut open the black wire and added the switch. I ended up making adjustments to the wire length later on once I knew where I'd be stashing all the electronics. Speaking of that interesting little challenge, let's jump over to the piece itself. One thing I noted early on was this lady's very skinny ankles. I went with a fiberglass rod that could be run down the whole handle for maximum stability. I cut out 3 pieces of the handle shape from Coscom's 4mm high density EVA foam. Then for the piece in the middle, I marked where the rod would lay. It does get very close to the edges in spots, so you can either widen the handle a tad, or you can do what I did and take the risk and make some small repairs later. I attached the first two pieces, but before laying in the rod, I had to figure out where to place the electronics. I made a whole handle earlier and then attempted to retrofit the electronics after the handle was already done. And this was a huge pain, so I would recommend doing it this way, but you'll still need to be mindful of the empty spaces when you're sanding it later. The only plan I could come up with for accessing the battery was to leave the top portion unglued and then run magnets along the edges. I was able to get these super tiny magnets from K&J Magnetics, so I was pretty confident that this was going to work. I glued up the handle with the exception of the area where the electronics are, and then I tapered the whole handle to a point using a box cutter. I also rounded the whole thing and added some shape before taking it to the Dremel for sanding. I also used the Dremel to cut in the lines for the metal pieces at the top and the bottom. As I mentioned before, I ended up needing to make some small repairs where I busted through the thin spots. I repaired these spots using some foam clay and a little bit of super glue later on for extra support. Once that was done, I went back over the whole handle with my stone bit for smoothing, and then I used my sanding drum to add some marks on the metal sections. Now it's time for the magnets. I carefully placed them along the edge and burned in a little space for them to sit. Then I used some paint to place the magnets on the other side. This actually ended up working out better than I expected. Now we can move on to the sculpting. I decided to use Cosclay for this. Cosclay is a relatively new product that I've been wanting to try. It's a polymer clay that cures to a more rubbery finish, making it more durable than traditional polymer clays. However, it is an oven-baked clay, so I needed to find a way to bake the sculpt separate from the handle and then attach it once it was cured. And this would actually also allow me to hide the wires inside the sculpt. Using a digital caliper, I measured the precise width of the fiberglass rod and the wires together. This allowed me to purchase a steel tube that was exactly the right size to slide over top. It just needed to be trimmed to size. I also broke the pins off the little 3-volt battery holder during this process, so maybe buy better ones than I did. I trimmed the steel rod using a cutoff wheel attachment for my Dremel. This took some time, but it did the job. Make sure you're wearing proper protection for this. So now we have the base for the sculpt that will slide right over the rod and the LED. The clay work comes next. Cosclay works a lot like any other polymer clay in that you have to knead it to make it workable. I opted for a clay roller to speed up this process. However, in the next step, I learned that Cosclay is not exactly like other polymer clays. I made a base of tinfoil and masking tape like I normally would, and slapped some clay on it and got to work, but I did not realize that Cosclay does not like masking tape. After a few days, the whole sculpt cracked off the base, revealing super slimy, sticky masking tape. Big old fail. But I did some digging and found a suggestion in their FAQ for metal repair tape. It's like thick aluminum foil with adhesive on the back. So I remade the tinfoil base and covered it with the correct tape this time, and then got back to work lumping on clay. I worked on the general shapes using the pattern first, just gradually building up areas. After I had a good base shape to work with, I went back to the pattern to mark out the main shapes. After that, it's a lot of staring at the reference images. I will be including the reference images I use with the pattern. This would have been rather difficult without solid reference images, so big thank you to my friend Patrick for all of those. After the main shapes are in place, I laid in a lot of the ridges and then worked them into the sculpt using my favorite little hook tool. I used the same process for the many folds of fabric. It's been a long time since I sculpted fabric, like literally since college, which was a long time ago. But once the fabric portion was done, I could work on sculpting the arms. I started with some little logs that I bent and shaped so they didn't look like noodles. The details here aren't super important since the fabric will be added on top anyway. It took a lot of alterations in size before I got these to a proportionate place. But once I had a nice pair of arms, I moved on to the hands. I feel the need to mention that I suck at hands. I've only sculpted them once before, so it took me about 3 tries before I got a pair I was happy with. And I didn't end up filming it because I finally got the good pair while I was sculpting in my bed. Anyway, once the sculpt was complete, I put it in the oven to bake according to the package instructions. Back to the handle, I sealed it with 3 coats of Flexbond to help fill in some of the messy areas and create a smooth final product. Once that was dry, I base coated the handle using this funky brown color I created. The head of the cane was base coated using Plaid Effects metallic silver paint. After a few good coats, I went in with a super watery black wash to make the metal look aged and dirty. Normally I'd wipe it with a paper towel, but that wasn't giving me good results here, so I cleaned and dried the brush in between to just spread out the paint. And I wiped off any of the high spots using my fingers. I used a similar process for the handle, but the paper towel worked fine here. After that, I sealed both pieces with some semi-gloss spray varnish. Now came the very delicate task of getting the gem into place. The cosplay had just enough give that I could get the gem into place without ruining the sculpt. But if you do happen to break a finger or two like I did, super glue works just fine. I forgot to film it, but I sanded the back of the gem using a medium grit sandpaper in order to diffuse the light from the LED behind it. Then I glued the gem in place using some gap-filling super glue. With the gem secured, I attached the sculpt to the fiberglass rod using the same super glue. And now it's ready for blood. I used the same blood mixture that was left over from my last video and just did a lot of spattering, dripping, and smearing. Voila! She is complete. So that about wraps it up, guys. I'm surprisingly happy with how this turned out because this was a struggle and a half. I basically made 2 of these. That was not the plan. The head is a little heavier than I wanted it to be. Like, it literally says in the description of this weapon that, you know, the head is like deceptively heavy and it's perfect for like whacking people over the head. But it was not my plan to make it as heavy as it is. It's not heavy, but like you see in some images, like he holds it from down here. Like I would not trust holding this from way down here. Even with the reinforcement and the high density foam, like I'm still not, I just am not trusting of materials in general. I'm just not. I also like this cosplay stuff. I really liked working with it once I got a few of the little kinks ironed out. Even though it is supposed to be like super flexible and way durable and stuff, and I've seen people throw their delicate sculptures on the ground just to like test this theory, I really don't want to test that theory. I messed this up enough times already. I think I'm good. I'm good. Any comments, questions, concerns, whatever, please leave them in the comments below. If you're not already subscribed and you're still lurking, can you please subscribe? I need more subscribers. That being said, I do appreciate each and every one of you that is subscribed. It totally makes my day seeing your comments and seeing you guys enjoy this process and talking about making props and costumes of your own. Halloween is right around the corner, so I really can't wait to see if anybody puts my patterns or my tutorials to good use. Like that would be like the dream come true. So that's all I got for now. So until next time, stay tuned for awesome.